work doing cash flow analysis, and it was a lot of busy work that, in my opinion, wasn't incredibly interesting, so I went ahead and skipped that so that we could do what I think is some more interesting stuff later on in the course. So kind of bypass that. Chapter 4 is on ratio analysis. What is a ratio? I'm sure you've had this in at least 2 courses, 3403 and Intermediate Corporate Finance. One semester they had me teach a class that I don't normally teach, and I looked on the schedule and it said Fin, INT, I think that's all it said, Fin, INT or something like that, and I glanced at it and I thought they wanted me to teach international finance. And I almost had a heart attack. I could go through a foreign currency exchange with you and do a little bit of triangular arbitrage and stuff like that, which would probably take about 2 or 3 weeks. And then after that, I would be doing some serious prep. They'd talk about corporate intermediate finance. So you've had it, I'm sure you've had it in at least 2 courses. What is a ratio? What is it that we're talking about? Yeah.
It's like a percentage?
Okay. Okay, a percentage of what?
2 things that you're calculating?
Okay, yeah, we're primarily, I guess we could find some exceptions to this, but primarily what we're doing is we're expressing one part of the financial statements against the other part of the financial statements, I guess say as a percentage. Okay? That's what we're doing. That's why we went through, that's why accounting is a prereq for your finance course, and why I went through this big old reminder from you is because with our ratio analysis, which we love to do in finance, that information is coming off of financial statements. Okay? So all we're doing is expressing one part of the financial statements against another part of the financial statements as a ratio. Okay? To me, ratio analysis is part art and part science. Okay? The science part is that clearly for a given question, there are probably going to be some ratios that are more relevant than others. Okay? So, for example, if you're going and you're looking for a short-term loan, right, then probably your liquidity ratios are going to be more important than your leverage ratios. Okay? I didn't say your leverage ratios weren't important. What I said was probably your liquidity ratios would be more important. Okay? And vice versa. So that's kind of the science part of it. The art part of it is you can use whatever ratio you want. You can modify the ratios however you want to. In fact, in my opinion, with you guys as finance majors who are out there trying to outthink all the other finance majors, whether it's analyzing financial statements for the purpose of purchasing the stock, or analyzing your own financial statements for the purpose of enhancing the efficiency of your own company relative to your competitors, you can modify them. Whatever is the most meaningful to you is what you should do. Okay? And that's one of the things that hopefully you've been doing in your college career here at UCF is developing your thinking. Okay? Because that's what this is all about. Right? So with ratio analysis, this isn't law that we're talking about. You can do whatever you want. Right? What they've listed in the book and what presumably you've studied in prior classes are the common ratios that we use. Okay? But if you're looking at your inventory turnover ratio, well, should you use beginning of year inventory, end of the year inventory, average inventory, weighted average inventory? Okay, just off the top of my head, that's 4 different ways to calculate the same ratio. And really, we could go into the limit and calculate it, probably an unlimited number of ways. Which should you do? Whichever is the most meaningful. And again, that's the part art and part science, because clearly there will be some, depending on the circumstances, there will be some calculations that are clearly more accurate, more informative than other calculations. Okay? But whichever one you use is the part art. Okay? So that's what we're doing here with ratio analysis. What I want you to do in this course on the exam with ratio analysis is really 2 main things. One is to calculate the ratio. 2 is to interpret the ratio. Okay? So make sure you can calculate the ratio, of course. make sure that you can interpret the ratio. All right? And interpreting the ratio really boils down to understanding whether a higher ratio is good or bad. Okay? We were just doing that with the gross margin. You guys all know that a higher gross margin is good. And I'm happy that you know that. All right? You don't have to memorize every ratio in the book, but there are a few that I would like you to memorize just because they're commonly quoted. Okay, so in my opinion, if you graduate with a finance degree and you don't know what gross margin is, that's not good. Okay, so just my opinion. So the ones that I would like you to memorize are the current ratio, which is current assets divided by current liabilities. Quick ratio, which is also known as
Acid ratio.
the what?
Acid test.
The acid test ratio. And this is
Current assets minus inventory.
outstanding. Current assets minus inventory divided by current liabilities. Why are we picking on inventory? Why are we taking inventory out of this?
It's not very liquid.
Because generally speaking, it's the least liquid of our current assets. So with the quick ratio, we're focusing on more liquid assets than with the current ratio. Which kind of makes sense because if we could sell inventory at will, we've got a great business. That's what we're in business to do. Cash ratio, which is
Is that
cash divided by current liabilities. Yeah, and when I say interpret the ratio, I'm sure you guys already have a feel for this, but just to make sure that we have all the holes filled in, the following, if you had me for 3403, you've heard this before, but the following thought process will get you through most ratios. So in the book, make sure, we're not going to go through every single ratio they have in the book, but you should remind yourself of all those ratios and go through this thought process using the current ratio, for example, which is current assets divided by current liabilities. Well, generally speaking, before we start talking about Miller, Modigliani, and all this other stuff you've been studying, generally speaking, what do we want to do with our assets? Increase them or decrease them? Maximize or minimize? Maximize. Numerator going up. Generally speaking, what do we want to do with our liabilities? Maximize or minimize?
Minimum.
Minimize. Denominator going down. The mathematical result on this ratio is it goes up. So higher is better. Okay, so that will get you through most of it. Okay, it will not get you through, I don't think it will, debt to equity ratio, which is one of my favorites. Debt to equity ratio is, of course, total debt divided by total equity. Total debt divided by total equity. Well, going through what we just talked about, it's, at least to me, it's not that obvious, assuming you believe in an optimal capital structure. But what can we use this ratio as an indicator of? Leverage, in other words. Well, what does leverage do for us?
The financial asset.
If our debt to equity ratio goes up, has our leverage gone up or down? Up. If our leverage goes up, what does that mean about our business? Outstanding. It's become more risky. It's become more risky. So what I'm trying to get at here is that, in my view, the main value of the debt to equity ratio is that it's an indicator of risk. So the higher our debt to equity ratio, the more risky our business.
So then necessarily that ratio is all in how you look at it. Like if you're really risk averse, then you would want that low.
Okay.
But if you're shooting for high returns and you got a high risk factor and you're real young, then then you may want a high number there.
Okay, you're sort of reading my mind, which may be good or bad depending on how you view it.
I'm gonna view it as good.
Higher risk, that bonus points.
That's what
Higher,
No, no,
higher,
no.
higher debt to equity ratio means higher risk. Is that good or bad? Following on Tommy's question, is that good or bad?
Depends
Okay, depends on what?
what the investment is.
Tony?
The firm's situation.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
Well, if the firm is able to take on more risk, then they're going to be making more money. If they're in a strong financial position,
Okay.
they're able to take on more risk.
Okay.
They're going to be making on more money.
Okay,
So it shows that they're kind of more confident in.
Okay.
It could show that the managers are confident in their current financial situation.
okay, a couple of points in there. Let me say the same thing a little different. President of the Young Investors Club, very good. I'm going to stop picking on you about that. I don't like that.
All good.
But, no, a couple of points in there. One is that you want to employ leverage. And I say this cautiously with the 3403 crowd, but I'll say it a little more aggressively with you guys as much more sophisticated, financially trained now. You want to take, you know that you have to accept risk to get return. You guys all know that.
Yes.
You know that the relationship should be the more risk you take, the more return you will, certainly more return you would require. Okay? So you want to hit leverage when you're expecting to be making a lot of money. So if you're expecting a few good years to come where your sales are going to be growing exponentially or what have you, then that's when you would want to take on leverage because that's what would maximize your returns. Right? The opposite would be true. If you were expecting a slump in your sales, for example, then you would want to stay away from leverage. Because leverage is going to make you either the hero or the goat. Okay? If you're making a lot of money, leverage is going to make you the hero. If you're losing a lot of money, leverage is going to make you the goat. Okay? So if you're expecting bad times, then you would want to stay away from leverage. Okay? So you would want to decrease that ratio from the inside of the company. Now, looking at it, the second part of what Tony said, looking at it from the outside of the company, we could arguably infer management's insider information, and that's the point of financial statement analysis right there. That's the point of business analysis right there, is to infer insider information. Why are the managers doing what they're doing? Well, if we do a trend analysis, and we see that their debt-to-equity ratio has been increasing over the last 3 or 4 years, then based on what I just said, we would argue, we would hope that what that means is that managers taking on more leverage because they're expecting good times. Of course, it could mean something else,
Yeah.
and that is they're borrowing because they need the money. So it may actually be an indicator of bad times. You're going to see that on the real-world example that I have for you when we get to it either today or tomorrow. Okay? So just with that one ratio, that's the, in fact, with the example that I have, okay, as much as I like this ratio, I've actually, to be honest with you, I've kind of become more fond of another ratio because this ratio gets real tricky when equity turns negative. Well, you're going to see that. The automakers, right before the auto bailout. I'm going to show you that probably tomorrow. Okay. So if equity goes negative, the answer to your question is the reason it goes negative is because you're losing money. That's why it goes negative. Well, of course, I mean, that would be net of dividends. Well, you're going to see it. Stay tuned. Don't go away. You're going to see it. So equity would be negative. So now our debt-to-equity ratio becomes difficult to interpret. Okay? So I've actually become fond of the debt ratio. Debt ratio, which is debt divided by assets, so total debt divided by total assets. Noticing it's the same information. Assets equal debt plus equity. Okay? It's the same information. It's just being presented a little bit differently. That's all. Okay? And I've actually become fond of this ratio for two reasons. One, it solves the problem of when equity is negative, because when equity is negative, what happens to this ratio? That'd be a good exam question. I didn't think to put it on this exam, so I'll give you that tip. I have to remember that. So that would be a good exam question right there.
Becomes higher.
Yes. What higher value? What value would we see?
You see a smaller assets, total assets, because if the equity is negative, then your total assets minus, whatever your negative equity, subtract that, make that lower.
Okay, I don't know that I could argue with that. But what would you definitely see? You're going to see this on the automakers. Well, the other reason I like this ratio is easy to interpret. This is because this is your percentage of assets that have been financed by debt. Well, if your equity is negative, then how much of your assets have been financed by debt? Yeah. So if it goes negative, your debt to equity ratio is going to go higher than 1. So if 120% of your assets have been financed by debt, then you know you've got a negative equity. You'll see that with the automakers. Okay? So again, this is why we went through the pain of the financial statements the first week. Okay, get those relationships going. Okay. So anyhow, make sure you're on top of debt to equity ratio. More importantly, this is an indicator of risk. We already talked about gross margin, operating profit margin, and total profit margin. We already talked about that. Gross margin, gross profit divided by sales. Operating profit margin, operating income divided by sales. Total, you know what I mean, net income divided by sales. I didn't think I said that correctly, but you know what I mean.
What's the last one on that?
Total profit margin. So, or just profit margin. So I just say profit to me, you get confused operating profit. Okay. So we're good on those? Okay. And then the last two is return on equity and return on assets. Return on equity, of course, is net income divided by total equity. Return on assets is net income divided by total assets. Okay, basic measures of return. Okay. And those of you who want to start your own business, this ROE, I would think, would be near and dear to your heart, because the E is how much you've invested. Okay. So if we've got net income divided by equity, E is how much you have invested. NI is how much you received on your investment. Okay, so I would think that that would be near and dear, should be near and dear to you. Okay. So on the exam, if I ask you about these ratios, I will expect you to know them. If I give you any other ratios on there, or if I ask you about any other ratios, I will give you those ratios on the exam. Again, these are just common ratios that you hear quoted a lot, and therefore, in my opinion, you should be familiar with without having to go and look them up in the book or on the exam. Okay. Questions? Questions, and I'm being serious. Being sincere.
So these are the ones that you're saying you want us to know how to calculate and interpret it?
Well, I want you to, yeah, you should be able to calculate and interpret all of them. Okay, these are the ones that I want you to memorize. Okay. So, again, if I ask you about, fixed asset turnover ratio, okay, I'll give you the ratio, but you should still be able to interpret that ratio. If I give it to you, I would hope you can calculate it. If I give you the ratio and you can't calculate it, I guess I need to post a few more videos. All right, other question. Other question. Okay. Let's see, what else about the basics? You guys know how to use, you know what ratios are used for. The first set of ratios are the liquidity ratios. We defined liquidity already. What is liquidity? How do we define liquidity? Exam review. You guys should do really well on this exam. You should do really well on this exam. How do we define liquidity?
Cash you're able to recover without.
Okay. The speed and ease with which we can convert an asset to cash without a significant loss in value. Without a significant loss in value. Okay, so as a reminder, your liquidity ratios, current, quick, and cash, like I have listed up there, are about your ability to meet your short-term liabilities, which would, again, I would think would be clearly relevant for short-term financing needs, less relevant for long-term financing needs. I didn't say they weren't important, but less relevant for that. So that's your first first category. Second category are your efficiency ratios, and what are these generally telling us?
How well the firm is performing?
Yeah, performing based on what? Because I mean, all of our ratios are telling us how well the firm are performing, but the efficiency ratios.
How well we're using our assets.
Exactly. How well, how efficiently we're using our assets. How well we're able to take our assets and generate sales from them. Okay. I want to use one of these ratios as an example. Okay, and that's the inventory turnover ratio, which I already alluded to. In the book, they calculate the inventory turnover ratio as cost of goods sold divided by average inventory. And this is actually what I was alluding to a few minutes ago when I was saying that, this isn't a law. Okay, this is just what's been developed over the years. This is what your predecessors have done. Okay, so now you take this and stand on their shoulders and extend it. And if it works well, contact me in 10 or 15 years after it's been working well, and I would like you to come in and guest lecture on the next people that are coming through on this topic. And I'm actually being completely sincere about that. If it works well, contact me. I'd love to have you come in and guest lecture. Okay? Assuming I'm still in this business, which I probably will. Okay. So inventory turnover ratio, we could, and you'll sometimes also see this as sales divided by average inventory, noticing that the only difference is the markup between sales and cost of goods sold. Okay? Well, inventory turnover ratio, traditionally, what do we want to see out of this ratio? Let's say that last year the ratio was, 2, and this year the ratio is 3.2. Well, how do we interpret that? Okay, yeah, this is how quickly we're turning over our inventory. Okay? This is how quickly we're getting our inventory in and getting it the heck out of there. Well, so is a higher ratio good or bad?
Good.
Traditionally, it's good. Why?
Because you're selling more.
Okay, well, not necessarily, because our sales could be down, but and see, now here's the analysis. Our sales could be down, but we could still have a higher inventory turnover ratio, indicating that we're still moving inventory out the door quicker. Why is it, really what I'm asking is, why is it important to move inventory quickly? We get it in, we get it out. Outstanding. Because, and we could probably come up with some other reasons as well, but the primary reason in my view is because there are holding costs associated with the inventory. So to the extent we hold less inventory, then we incur less holding costs, which of course maximizes value. Right?
It also increases the cash conversion cycle too.
Okay.
Which means you have to hold less cash for.
Okay, right, which would go hand in hand with the holding costs. Okay, all of which is going to depend on the industry. Okay? Because what I'm doing purposely is having a general conversation with you. Okay? So we graduate and we get out of here and we've got our, we got our software, we've got our cookie cutter all. So, oh, okay, inventory turnover ratio went up, that's good, good deal. Sounds good, we report it to the board and we're good to go. Okay? I suggest to you that that's not necessarily true. It depends on the inventory. Depends on the business. If we are Publix, where our inventory consists of a lot of perishable items, that may very well be true. But I actually learned what I think is a valuable inventory lesson from a hobby store that I shop at quite frequently. And I got to know the manager quite a bit, the most successful hobby store in the area. Okay? And we got into conversation about inventory one day, and he was telling me that, and what he has, I think he has like $1 million tied up in inventory. I mean, a massive amount, and this is a hobby store, massive amount of inventory tied up in there. And he told me one time that he was always getting static from employees and others who, of course, knew more than him, that he shouldn't have everything tied, he shouldn't have that much money tied up in inventory because he could take that money and stick it in a CD and earn interest on it and reduce, the holding cost conversation and all that kind of stuff. And he stood firm. And he didn't do that, obviously, and I think that he was exactly correct because in that business, right, having a high inventory gets customers in the door. I would drive past a half a dozen stores to get to his because I knew that when I went to his store, 98% of the time, I walked out of there with what I needed. All these other stores that had lower inventory and therefore higher inventory turnover ratios, presumably, well, I go there, I may get what I want, I may not get what I want. I drive past all of them to go down to his store, and his store was always packed, even in this economic meltdown. A hobby store? Are you kidding me? And he's still down there cranking out the cash. Okay? So in his business, honestly, I probably wouldn't pay much attention to the inventory turnover ratio at all. Okay? Because that big inventory, again, the point of that is the big inventory is what's getting customers in the door in the first place. Oh, while I'm there, I either buy something else while I'm there or say, man, that's a really cool, I might have to get that next time. And that increases the sales. Tony.
Also, when you have a store like that, which specializes in collectible items, a lot of those pieces gain in value as time goes on. So when they're sitting in the shop, it's basically like the money's being in a long-term CD. Slowly over time, they're gonna be worth more. So if he owns the only red special edition boat, it's sitting in there instead of it flipping real fast. And 10 years later, it's worth a lot more.
Well, yeah, I would agree with that because in his business, his increase in sales, I'm sure, is way out swamping what he would earn in a CD. But really, you were alluding to another business, which is the collectibles. Another friend of mine owned an antique store. All right? So in that business, maybe the inventory turnover ratio really doesn't mean that much. You might have something sitting in there at some price, and nobody's really buying it, but it's bringing in customers. They're all saying, "Man, you got to go down there and check this out. It's pretty cool." It's not really moving, but it's bringing customers in the door, which maximizes sales. Okay.
Also, I want to say he probably get a higher return on his money because he's getting a more discount because he's buying in bulk.
Well, that's exactly what he's doing. I mean, he told me that instead of buying, when this inventory starts getting low, instead of buying 2 or 3 models or whatever it is what he's doing, he says he waits until they go on sale and he buys 25 of them.
Yes.
He's been doing this a long time, so all the suppliers know that. So not only does he get a discount, but he also gets favorable credit terms because he's such a cash cow for them.
Yes.
Relationship analysis. Financial relationship analysis. Okay. And my broader point of this is that we can have similar conversations with probably multiple ratios. So again, ratio analysis, my opinion, what you've been learning and what we're going through in chapter 4 is kind of a review, is the traditional view of ratios. I mean, that's how we traditionally analyze them. But you guys, as college graduates, able to think ahead of other people, the traditional way to go may not necessarily be the best way to go for your particular set of facts and circumstances. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. That's what separates you guys from the others. I always tell the 3403 crowd, if there was only one way, think about it, if there was a correct answer to any given credit or to get any given situation, then we'd all make the same amount of money. All of the businesses would all make the same amount of money. The reality is they don't. They all make different amounts of money. Okay. Questions or other good comments on that? Okay, that's a pretty good place to stop. So why don't we wrap it up today?